All right, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got started in the disability community.
Sure thing. My name is Stacy Branham. I'm an associate professor of informatics at the University of California, Irvine. And I identify as a disabled woman in computing. So, all the work I do is really driven by my dedication to ensuring that people with disabilities are not only able to um, come to universities and be part of academia, but also be part of the computing community. And specifically, I think that they need to be in leadership positions in order to make real change. How did I get on this track? Sometimes I think back to the first time that I entered a classroom in my undergraduate institution. My first computer science class had 100 seats in it, and when I looked around, I immediately noticed there were only three other people who were femme presenting. So, as a woman, I have felt immediately that I didn't belong there. And as I started paying attention, I realized that women were absent not only in the seats around me, but also at the front of the classroom and in the workplaces. In industry. And the result was that these places tended to be very masculine and tended not to serve the needs of women. So that's when I started to really think about identity, minoritized identity, and how computing needs to do better to make sure that those folks are contributing. Another key moment, though, happened many years later. After I earned my bachelor's degree in computer science, my PhD, I was just starting my postdoc. And by sheer chance, I ended up working with Sean Kane. Now, Dr. Sean Kane is a disabled researcher, and he actually invented the screen reader technology for touchscreen phones. So you may be familiar with VoiceOver for iOS. Um, Before that, he wrote an academic paper that essentially described that technology. So, working with him, I started to think a lot about disability. And I also had the privilege of working with a grad student at the time. His name was Ali Abdurrahmani. Ali and I are still good friends. But Ali is a Persian man. He was a software engineer in his earlier life. And when we met, I came to know him as a blind screen reader user, and he was the first one I'd ever met. So he taught me a lot about what it meant to be blind and the assistive technologies blind folks use. And it helped me realize that although I had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD in computer science, I had never thought about how people who are blind use technologies. And that meant that the technologies I was building were completely inaccessible to them and to other people with disabilities. So I thought there was something really wrong about that. And the other thing that happened is I came to realize that I had a disability. I have a non-apparent disability or a few. I have a mental illness. I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So I experience anxiety and depression, and I have something called trichotillomania, which means that I compulsively pull out my hair to kind of deal with the stresses that I have. Anyway, coming to recognize that the term disability, the disability community, um, notions of like the social model of disability, that these things could bring value and understanding and joy to my life, were really impactful. And together with learning about how I had never really thought about designing accessible technologies prior to that point, together those things made me really want to advocate for people with disabilities in the spaces I am. The spaces I'm in. So ever since then, I've really been a champion of making sure that, no woman, no disabled person ever feels like in a, say, a computer science classroom that they don't belong there. And that they actually have the tools and the supports to thrive there and to ultimately become leaders in the field, not only in academia, but in computing. So that's how I got started, and it's been maybe almost 15 years since I got the bug, and I'm still going strong.
Yeah, that's cool. So given those experiences, what do you teach your students? How do you sort of translate what you've learned to
Yeah.
the classes that you teach with your students? So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. As a professor, teaching is one part of the three things that I do. So I also do research and I also do what's called service. I'd be happy to talk about those other two things, but specifically in the classroom, I think about teaching accessibility and teaching accessibly. So let me take the first one of those. So teaching accessibility. I think it's almost a crime that I had all these degrees in computer science and never learned about accessibility in the classroom. And so I want to make sure that doesn't happen in my own backyard. So whenever I'm teaching classes, I teach classes on, how to build computing systems, but also about how to design them. And how to study them. So I teach all those sorts of classes to undergrads and graduate students. And when I teach them, I make sure that they learn some fundamentals about accessibility. So that can include things like learning how to evaluate a website for WCAG compliance, WCAG compliance, how to create accessible digital documents like Google Docs and PDFs, and making and testing students' abilities by having them submit all assignments in accessible formats. And that can also mean things like sometimes I host a career panel where I feature people who are doing accessibility work in industry. And inevitably, some of those people have disabilities. So trying to make sure they're exposed early to role models who are walking the walk and who have disability identities, I think is part of what I do to teach accessibility in the classroom. But the other part is the accessibility part is making sure that actually my course is accessible because people with disabilities are here in academia and more of them ought to be. And there shouldn't be barriers that I'm erecting by how I teach the class. So there's a few different things I try to do. One of them, especially since the pandemic, is it's really opened my eyes to the importance of having what we call a high flex environment, meaning students can choose on a day-to-day basis whether they can be in person in the classroom physically with me or if they need to attend remotely. Or sometimes they need to be asynchronous. So I make sure that there's always a live Zoom connection and there's always a recording. Another thing that I do is make sure that there's live captions on the big presentation in front of the classroom so that folks can see what I'm saying and read what I'm saying. Another example of trying to make the classroom content more accessible is just making my digital files accessible in advance so that students don't have to then go ask the Disability Services Office for accessible materials. So I'm really passionate about making sure that people with disabilities are not only like featured in the content of what we're learning, but that I'm aware of and respecting the fact that they are in the classroom and they are the next generation technologists.
Hmm. You also talked about like two different buckets that you
Yeah,
work on besides teaching in
that's right.
research and one other thing that I'm gonna
Service.
keep forgetting, service. Yeah. So
Yeah.
could you talk a little bit about those?
Oh, happily, happily. So, research is obviously about trying to ask new questions that haven't been asked and finding answers. And in my research, of course, I focus on accessible computing. So it's all about how technology and social context can both empower but also disempower people who with disabilities. And I tend to work with blind and low vision folks still. So as an example, I have lots of different threads of research at any time, but just one example project we're working on. One of my PhD students, Cameron Cassidy, he himself is a blind man, and we've been studying how technology design can better support blind parents when they're reading with their children. I find this really exciting because right now the assistive technologies that we build for blind screen reader users is really kind of like technical and kind of like get down to business work oriented, like a screen reader. It's this synthetic voice that reads really quickly. It's on a screen, your laptop or your phone. It's not great for cuddling up with your kid at night and, reading them a book. And so what we did is we talked with a lot of blind parents, and we asked them about how they read with their kids and how to improve that experience. And Cameron came up with this idea of using voice assistants, like Alexa, like Google Assistant, to kind of be a reading companion and fill in a few of the gaps in knowledge that exist because books are currently not particularly accessible. So say just really quick, an example is like if there's a Braille reader, they might have a print Braille book. That's a book that has the visuals for the sighted child, and it also has this clear overlay with Braille for the words. But often those do not include image descriptions, right? There's an assumption that the reader is often it's like a child who's blind, not a parent who's blind, who's taking care of a child, right? So we need to make sure that we're thinking about supporting blind folks who care for others. And what the voice assistant can do is provide a verbal image description. So the parent can now talk about the image with their child and understand the story holistically. So that's an example of one of the things. And we're hoping that we can make this skill available for free on Alexa and possibly be able to partner with, say, libraries and provide accessible books, print books to blind parents. But just like high level, taking a step back, my research is really interested in making sure that we're centering the voices of people with disabilities. We're always asking them directly, what's your experience? What do you like? And if they're not on the research team, then they're definitely in the research or on an advisory board supporting us. We also try to focus on integration and equity. I really dislike when we think about like just, one person with a disability interacting with their technology in isolation. No, they need to be interacting in social groups, with other people with other disabilities, without disabilities. And so I always am thinking about, hey, how's the blind parent reading with the sighted kid? And maybe there's another parent in the room or another child in the room. Like there's a social setting, and that really matters and affects the design. And we're super action oriented. Like we want to make change in the world now. So it's not just about producing knowledge that goes into some esoteric academic journal that's behind a paywall. We don't like that. We're always trying to like have some practical outcomes now, if we can. So that was a long answer for research. Are you sure you want to hear about service? Because I could go
Yeah,
on.
service. Yeah, yeah. I'd love to hear. Yeah.
All right, cool, cool. So, this is part of like, if you've ever been in college and you have professors, there's like a hidden life of professors. And part of that hidden life is service. It's a really cool thing that a certain percentage of your time, maybe 20-30% of your time, is about giving back to your community, that whether that be your local community, your department, something at your university, or your research community. So there's all these different types of service we can do. And I like to do a lot of it, again, being action oriented. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. One of them in my research community, I had the privilege of serving as the accessibility adjunct chair for accessibility for my research community. Basically, the research community, they host all these conferences every year, maybe 25 or so, 26. And each of those conferences, there are research articles presented, which are in PDF format. And if you know any blind screen reader users, whenever you mention PDF, I think they're like eye twitches because PDFs are notoriously inaccessible to screen reader users if they're made improperly, which they most often are. In my research community, we have an automated process that produces completely inaccessible, like to a ridiculous degree, PDFs, such that the entire PDF is read as one word. There aren't any spaces between words, and you can't jump through the PDF. It's so bad. So we've known about this. We're trying to fix it. But in the meantime, one of the things I got to do in this role was say, hey, while we're working on a technical solution, we need a solution now. So we started a program where all these papers would be manually remediated, and we would pay up front to have all the PDFs made accessible. And it's been adopted by maybe a half a dozen or more conferences now annually. And so we're kind of like snowballing and just trying to make bigger impact. So that's one of the things. I can give an example too of what I'm doing at my university. Um, we recently heard from some local teachers of the visually impaired, TVIs. They came to me and said, "Hey, we don't know how to prepare our blind and low vision students so that they can succeed in college. And we especially don't know what technology they need to learn and use. We'd love to help prepare them. What should we do?" So we got together and we thought a lot about how we could start our relationship. And we devised a workshop, basically a half-day workshop, where we brought together, I think it was 12 blind and low vision high schoolers, maybe something like 30 teachers of the visually impaired, and then another 20 to 30 people at my university who are professors, students, educators. And we just tried to talk a little bit about, first of all, how do accommodations work in college and how is that different than high school? What are the technologies that you're going to need to use, and how to prepare for that? And then another thing was just showing them the successful current blind and low vision UCI affiliates, and all the cool work they're doing here so that the students know you belong here. There's important work for you to do, and here are some role models for you to look at. Um, so I could go on and on, but I just really think it's important that we're reaching out and trying to make real change now so that, for example, blind people can read research papers and produce them, and blind folks and their allies can make sure that they enter the pipeline, right? Enter college so that someday they can become the researchers who are making knowledge.
Mm-hmm. My next question is like, what have your students said about, your kind of the classes that they've taken with you? I'm sure that they have been a part of, I think do you have graduate students?
I
Um,
do.
yeah, so what have they said, when taking your classes and being a part of your graduate student, kind of, working as graduate students with you?
Yeah, it's honestly been really rewarding, but also a little sad to hear sometimes. When students take my Introduction to Human Computer Interaction class as juniors and seniors, they're computer science majors, they're data science majors, they're informatics majors. They say, I've never ever heard about accessibility before. It's the first time, and it opened my eyes, and it makes me want to be an advocate in the work I do going forward. It means a lot to me, but it means also that there's a lot of work to go. And excitingly, several of my colleagues are getting excited about accessibility and starting to integrate it into their courses as well. And I will say about teaching accessibly, that's the other half of the equation. Recently, a student anonymously nominated me for a teaching award, and they said the most, beautiful comment about how the high flex environment I create in class made it possible for them to take the class and succeed in it, as a person with a disability, which to me is like it's my reason for being here, and it meant a lot. And yeah, I'm very proud to be awarded that award later this year.
Mm-hmm. My next question is, how can accessible technologies, accessible design, make things more accessible for people with disabilities? Because I remember, the ADA was a significant piece of legislation that transformed, the landscape of like, making things accessible, not just for people with disabilities in the classroom, but also in the workplace, in all different contexts.
Yeah, you probably heard a lot about, universal design. Um,
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent of universal design, and exploring how when we make technologies more accessible for particular disability groups, that we actually make the technology more accessible to the broader population because of what folks, what we tend to call temporary and situational disabilities. So, for example, sometimes I'm driving in my car, my eyes are on the road. I can't look at my phone, but can I swipe on my phone while not looking at it? Yes, I can. And that means that technologies that serve blind folks actually can serve me. And sometimes one time I actually used some eye drops that were my husband's. I didn't realize that they were steroidal. I thought they were just like saline drops, and I couldn't see for like 2 hours, And in I have and there's some people who maybe have a temporary medical condition, like they just had a baby and they had preeclampsia and they have temporary vision loss for several days or months. Like, temporary and situational disabilities like these mean that many, many more people can benefit from having interfaces that are accessible and have flexibility in what modalities are used to communicate information. Um, so don't just have something visual, make it audio, make it tactile, give folks lots of different options, and then everyone has more options.
Hmm. So it's kind of like a wrap up. Like, what can, be done to like make things more accessible in the long run? Because things
Mhm.
are more accessible like today, but like they're still like with like, you know, in the job market, you have to get reasonable accommodations. I need this, this, and this. So what can be done in those and frankly other contexts to sort of
Mhm.
make it more accessible because
Yeah.
um it's still a lot of work to do in that
Oh, a
area.
massive amount of work. Um, yeah, so it's such a huge problem. And frankly, I don't think it's a technical one. What I mean by that is I think technology reflects our like personal and social biases. And so the key thing that we need to do is make sure that everyone, all of the citizens of the world, know about disability, know about their role in being, and being an ally to people with disabilities. And if that were the case, then I think we would just have a much more accessible world, technology included. I'll quote someone who was in a study of mine several years ago who said that it's important to do life with people with disabilities. It's the best way to just um, develop that natural relationship with someone else where you understand their needs, they understand yours. There's something that we call access intimacy between you. And we just need to have more integrated environments where people with and without disabilities are together. And that will produce environments where, discrimination is not acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's also a thing called inspiration porn where they're like people are
Yeah,
like, "Oh, you're such an inspiration. You inspire me to." I've heard that a lot. I'm like, "What?"
the worst.
Yeah. You
It's so
know,
bad. I sent an email around to a number of folks in my professional network trying to explain a few of these things. And someone wrote me, one of them was about inspiration porn. And someone wrote back to me and says, "Oh, the work you do is so inspirational. People with disabilities are so inspirational." I'm like, "Did you read the thing I just sent out?" So it is an uphill battle, but I think the more people talking about it, the work you're doing by just bringing us together as a community and helping us get the word out, I think is really, really critical um, to a better future.
yeah, it really is.